On March 14th, 2022, a Monday morning just after sunrise, a 67-year-old Kansas farmer named Eugene Kraft stood in the parts department of the Case IH dealership where he'd been a customer for 43 years. He held a printed invoice in his hand. The paper was still warm from the laser printer behind the counter. He wasn't angry yet. He was still trying to understand the number. The part he needed was a hydraulic pump for his 2019 Case IH Magnum 340. The same pump, same part number, same manufacturer, same red-painted casting, had cost him $340 in February when he'd ordered one for his other tractor. 6 weeks later, the price was $156. Not on sale, not back-ordered, not a different part. The same pump. $816 more. The parts manager, a man 10 years younger than Eugene who'd worked that counter for most of a decade, didn't make eye contact when he explained it. Corporate had restructured the parts distribution network. Everything now came through a single national fulfillment center in Oklahoma. Regional warehouses were closed. Inventory was consolidated. Shipping protocols were updated. There was a new handling fee structure. A logistics optimization surcharge. Expedited processing was now mandatory for all hydraulic components. The parts manager said the word modernization 3 times. Eugene asked if there was a mistake. The parts manager said no. Eugene asked if the old price would come back. The parts manager said he didn't know. Eugene folded the invoice, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked out without saying another word. He didn't buy the pump that day. He drove home, parked his truck in the machine shed, and sat there for 20 minutes with the engine off, looking at the Magnum through the windshield. The tractor had 1,100 hours on it. It was 3 years old. It still smelled new inside the cab. He'd financed it over 7 years at 4.2% interest. He had 4 years left on the loan. The hydraulic pump wasn't optional. Without it, the tractor couldn't lift the planter. Without the planter, he couldn't seed 900 acres of corn that needed to be in the ground in 5 weeks. He could pay $1,156 for the pump, or he could find another way. That night, Eugene called a man he hadn't spoken to in 2 years. A retired mechanic named Darrell Hopper who used to work for the same Case IH dealership back when it was independently owned, before the corporate buyout in 2018. Darrell was 74 years old. He lived 12 miles outside of town in a house with a steel building out back, where he rebuilt transmissions and hydraulic systems for farmers who couldn't afford dealer rates. Eugene asked if Darrell could source a hydraulic pump. Darrell said he'd make some calls. 3 days later, Darrell called back. He'd found a remanufactured pump from an independent hydraulic shop in Missouri. Same specs, same flow rate, 6-month warranty, $290 shipped. Eugene bought it. Darrell installed it on a Saturday morning. It took 4 hours. Eugene paid him $200 in cash and bought him lunch. The total cost was $490. The dealer would have charged $1,156 for the part, plus $480 in labor, plus a $95 diagnostic fee. Even though Eugene already knew what was broken, Eugene saved $1,041. But the savings wasn't the part that stayed with him. It was the realization. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about the long-term weight of farm equipment decisions, dealer relationships that shaped entire communities, and the quiet ways rural economies adapt when systems change, consider subscribing. These aren't trending topics. They're the kind of histories that only show their meaning across decades. We're preserving them here, one story at a time, for anyone who understands that farming has never been about one season. Eugene didn't set out to build anything. He just told his neighbor. The neighbor was a man named Russell Voss, 61 years old, who farmed 1,400 acres of wheat and milo and ran 2 Case IH Steiger 620 four-wheel drives. Russell had been complaining for months about parts delays and price increases, but he'd assumed it was temporary. Supply chain issues, pandemic aftermath, inflation that would eventually correct itself. When Eugene told him about the $1,156 pump and the $290 replacement, Russell went quiet on the phone. Then he asked for Darrell's number. 2 weeks later, Russell needed a DEF injector module for one of his Steigers. The dealer quoted $2,340 for the part and said it would take 9 days to arrive from the fulfillment center. Russell called Darrell. Darrell found a used module from a salvage yard in Nebraska that had been pulled from a low-hour tractor totaled in a hail accident, $680. It arrived in 3 days. Russell told 2 more farmers by May. Darrell was getting 4 or 5 calls a week. Most of the farmers calling him were men in their 50s and 60s who had been loyal Case IH customers for decades. They weren't trying to punish the brand. They weren't boycotting the dealer. They were just trying to keep their equipment running without taking on debt they couldn't justify. Because the price increases weren't limited to hydraulic pumps. A wiring harness that used to cost $108 now costs $407. A fuel injector that used to cost $620 now costs $890. A DF sensor that used to cost $95 now costs $384. The dealership had printed explanations taped to the parts counter. Supply chain constraints, inflationary pressures, increased freight costs, regulatory compliance updates, enhanced inventory management systems. But the farmers knew their own numbers. Freight hadn't tripled, regulations hadn't tripled, inflation hadn't tripled. What had changed was the system. Case IH's parent company, CNH Industrial, had eliminated 12 regional parts warehouses across the Midwest and consolidated everything into a single automated fulfillment center. The move was announced as an efficiency improvement, faster order processing, better inventory accuracy, reduced overhead. What it actually meant was that every parts order now traveled hundreds of additional miles, passed through additional handling checkpoints, and triggered new fees at every stage. The expedited handling fee alone added 18% to the base cost of any part classified as critical, and nearly every hydraulic, electrical, or emissions-related component was classified as critical. There was no way to opt out of expedited handling. There was no standard handling option. It was mandatory, and it was invisible until the invoice printed. Eugene started keeping a notebook. In it, he wrote down every part he priced at the dealer, every alternative source Darrell found, and the difference in cost. By the end of June, the notebook had 23 entries. The average dealer markup over independent sources was 312%. He showed the notebook to 5 other farmers at a co-op meeting in early July. One of them was a man named Leonard Gaskill, 59 years old, who had just spent $11,400 at the Case IH dealer for a transmission control module replacement on his Magnum 380. The part itself was $6,800. Labor was $3,200. Diagnostics and software licensing added another $1,400. Leonard looked at Eugene's notebook for a long time. Then he asked a question that changed the shape of everything that followed. What if we all just stopped going there? It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a boycott. It was a question about survival. Because what Leonard understood, what all of them were beginning to understand, was that the dealership wasn't loyal to them anymore. It was loyal to a fulfillment algorithm in Oklahoma and a profit margin set by executives in Illinois who had never planted a seed or changed a hydraulic filter. The dealership still had the same building, the same sign, some of the same employees, but it wasn't the same business. And if it wasn't the same business, why were they still treating it like it was? Eugene didn't answer Leonard's question that night, but 2 weeks later, he started making a list. He wrote down the names of every farmer he knew who ran Case IH equipment. Then he wrote down the names of independent mechanics, hydraulic rebuild shops, salvage yards, and aftermarket suppliers within 200 miles. Then he started making phone calls. By the end of August, Eugene had contacted 47 farmers and 16 independent service providers. He wasn't selling anything. He was just offering information. If you need a part, here's who might have it cheaper. If you need a repair, here's who can do it without the dealer markup. If you need diagnostics, here's a guy with the software who charges by the hour instead of by the visit. Most of the farmers said thank you and filed the information away. Some of them used it immediately. 3 of them told Eugene he was going to get himself in trouble. One of them, a man named Clayton Rourke, 72 years old, who had bought his first Case IH tractor in 1979, told Eugene he was being disloyal to a brand that had never let him down. Eugene didn't argue. He just said, the brand didn't raise the prices, the system did. Clayton didn't call him again for 4 months. But in January 2023, when Clayton's Magnum 210 threw a code for a faulty turbocharger actuator, and the dealer quoted $4,100 for the repair. He called Eugene and asked for the list. By then, the list had grown. What had started as a handwritten notebook had become a shared spreadsheet that 93 farmers across 4 counties were quietly updating and passing around. I'd included parts sources with phone numbers and contact names, independent mechanics sorted by specialty, diagnostic software providers who would remotely unlock Aurora codes for $150 instead of the dealer's $310 service call minimum, salvage yards that shipped hydraulic shops that rebuilt electrical specialists who could bypass proprietary modules when the dealer's ED replacement was the only option. It wasn't advertised. It wasn't posted online. It was just farmers helping farmers remember how things used to work before the system made it unaffordable to ask for help. The Case IH dealership noticed in March 2023, the service manager, a man named Todd Ehrlich, who had been with the dealership for 19 years, told Eugene that parts and service revenue had dropped 68% compared to the previous year. Todd didn't say it like an accusation. He said it like a fact that was going to cost him his job. Eugene asked if corporate had reconsidered the pricing structure. Todd said no. Eugene asked if there was any plan to bring back regional warehousing or reduce the handling fees. Todd said he didn't have that information, but he doubted it. Eugene asked what Todd was going to do. Todd said he was probably going to start looking for work somewhere else, because the dealership was projecting a 40% reduction in staff by the end of the year. Eugene didn't feel good about that, but he didn't feel responsible for it either, because the dealership hadn't asked the farmers what they needed. Corporate hadn't asked the farmers what they could afford. The system had simply recalculated the margins, optimized the logistics, and raised the prices, assuming loyalty was a constant that could absorb any cost. It wasn't. By summer 2023, the network Eugene had helped organize wasn't just a parts sharing list anymore. It had become a parallel service economy. Farmers were hiring independent mechanics to do full rebuilds in their machine sheds. They were buying diagnostic laptops preloaded with cracked software from Eastern Europe that could interface with Case IH systems without dealer authorization. They were cross-referencing OEM part numbers with aftermarket supply and discovering that a 1400 Case IH fuel filter assembly was functionally identical to a 210 Fleetguard unit with different paint. Some of them were still buying new Case IH equipment, but none of them were servicing it at the dealer anymore. And that created a problem the system hadn't anticipated. Because new Case IH tractors came with warranties that required dealer service to remain valid. If you took your Magnum 3.4 to an independent mechanic during the warranty period, even for an oil change, the warranty could be voided. If you installed an aftermarket part, the warranty could be voided. If you used diagnostic software that wasn't authorized by Case IH, the warranty could be voided. The tractors had telematics systems that reported everything back to corporate. They knew when you were running the machine. They knew when fault codes appeared. They knew when you cleared them. And if the data showed you'd tampered with anything, they knew that too. In September 2023, a farmer named Glenn Portman, 54 years old, who had bought a new Case Magnum 310 in April, had his warranty voided after he placed a FAF pressure sensor himself using a $90 part from an aftermarket supplier instead of waiting 9 days and paying $640 for the dealer to install the OEM version. The tractor flagged the non-OEM part. Corporate sent Glenn a letter. The powertrain warranty was canceled. He still had 2 years and 1,800 hours left on it. Glenn didn't fight it. He just told the other farmers. And that was when the quiet strategy shifted. Because, up until that point, most of the farmers had assumed they could keep buying new Case IH equipment and just avoid the dealer for service after the warranty expired. But if the warranty could be voided for doing basic maintenance yourself, for refusing to pay prices that had tripled overnight, then the warranty wasn't protection. It was leverage. And leverage only works if the other side doesn't know you're willing to walk away from it. In October 2023, Eugene was planning to trade in his 2015 Case IH Magnum 250 for a new Magnum 340. He'd already been pre-approved for financing. He'd already spec'd the tractor. He'd already scheduled the trade-in appraisal. But after what happened to Glenn, Eugene called the dealer and canceled. He didn't make a speech. He didn't explain. He just said he'd changed his mind. The salesman asked if there was a problem. Eugene said no. The salesman asked if it was a price issue. Eugene said no. The salesman asked if he was shopping other brands. Eugene said and hung up. 3 weeks later, Eugene bought a used 2018 Case IH Magnum 340 from a farm auction in Oklahoma. It had 890 hours on it. The farmer who'd owned it had died, and the estate was liquidating. Eugene paid $148,000 for a tractor that would have cost him $287,000 new. The warranty was already expired, which meant he could service it however he wanted. He drove it home on a flatbed and had Darrell go through the entire hydraulic system, the transmission, and the electronics. Darrell found 2 minor issues and fixed both of them for $320 in parts and $150 in labor. Eugene now had 2 Magnum tractors, both of them paid off or nearly paid off, both of them serviceable outside the dealer network, and he had no intention of ever buying new again. He wasn't the only one. By the end of 2023, 12 farmers in Eugene's network had made the same decision. They stopped buying new, they started buying used, they started keeping equipment longer, they started doing more of their own work. And the Case IH dealership that had served that region for 34 years posted a 61% decline in new equipment sales compared to 2022. Called it a market correction. They said rural incomes were down. They said commodity prices were unstable. They said interest rates were discouraging capital investment. They didn't say anything about the parts prices. They didn't say anything about the fulfillment center consolidation. They didn't say anything about the warranty policies that punished farmers for self-reliance because, from corporate's perspective, the pricing strategy was working. Revenue per parts transaction was up 127% year over year. Profit margins on service contracts were the highest they'd been in a decade. The efficiency improvements from centralized distribution had reduced overhead by 34%. On paper, the modernization was a success. But the paper didn't show the 93 farmers who had stopped calling. It didn't show the independent mechanics who were booked out 6 weeks in advance. It didn't show the quiet meetings in machine sheds where men in their 60s were teaching men in their 30s how to bypass electronic lockouts, rebuild fuel injectors, and source parts from salvage yards 3 states away. It didn't show the collapse of trust. Because trust isn't a line item, it's the thing that makes someone willing to pay more because they believe the relationship is worth it. And when the relationship becomes a transaction, when the dealership becomes a fulfillment portal, when the brand becomes a software license with a kill switch built in, trust doesn't fight back, it just leaves. In February 2024, Eugene got a call from Todd Ehrlich, the service manager. Todd had been let go. The dealership was down to half the staff it had in 2022. Parts and service hours had been cut to 4 days a week. The lot that used to stock 30 new tractors and combines now had 11 machines, most of them financed inventory the dealership couldn't move. Todd wasn't calling to complain. He was calling to ask if Eugene knew anyone hiring mechanics. Eugene gave him Darrell's number. 2 weeks later, Todd was working in Darrell's shop doing the same work he used to do at the dealership for farmers who used to be his customers. The only difference was the price, and the fact that no one had to drive past a locked gate to get help. By spring 2024, the network had grown to 128 farmers. It wasn't organized, there was no meeting, no membership, no charter. It was just information, shared quietly, between people who understood that the system had optimized itself into something that no longer worked for them. Some of them still bought Case IH equipment. Some of them switched brands. Some of them stopped buying new altogether and started running 20-year-old tractors that could be fixed with a wrench instead of a laptop. But all of them had stopped believing that loyalty to a brand meant the brand would be loyal back. Because the brand wasn't a dealership anymore. It wasn't a handshake. It wasn't a parts manager who knew your name and your father's name and remembered which tractor you bought in 1987. The brand was a fulfillment center in Oklahoma, a pricing algorithm, a warranty enforcement system, a telematics dashboard. And when you called it, no one answered. In June 2024, Eugene was in his shop rebuilding a hydraulic cylinder on his 2019 Magnum when a younger farmer, 32 years old, named Marcus Treadwell, stopped by to ask a question. Marcus had just bought his first new Case IH tractor, a Magnum 250, financed over 8 years. He was proud of it. He wanted to know if Eugene had any advice about maintaining it. Eugene didn't say anything for a long time. Then he wiped his hands on a rag, walked over to his workbench, and pulled out the notebook he'd started 2 years earlier. He handed it to Marcus. "This is what it costs to keep one of these running if you do it their way," Eugene said. "And this is what it costs if you don't." Marcus flipped through the notebook. He didn't say anything. Eugene walked back to the hydraulic cylinder and picked up his wrench. "You can do whatever you want," Eugene said. "But if you're going to take on that much debt, you should know what it actually costs to own the thing you think you're buying." Marcus left with the notebook. Eugene didn't know if he'd ever look at it again. But 3 months later, Marcus called. He needed a fuel filter assembly. The dealer wanted $1,220. Marcus asked if Eugene knew anyone who could get it cheaper. Eugene gave him 3 names, and the number became 129. By the end of 2024, the Case IH dealership that had once employed 24 people employed 7. The building was still there. The sign was still red, but the parking lot was empty most days. And when farmers drove past it, they didn't feel anger. They didn't feel betrayal. They just felt the quiet, inevitable weight of a system that had forgotten the cost of forgetting the people who made it possible. Eugene still farms. He still runs Case IH equipment. Both of his Magnums are paid off now. He doesn't plan to buy another new tractor, not because he can't afford it, but because the thing he used to be buying, the relationship, the support, the knowledge that someone would answer the phone when something broke, doesn't exist anymore. What exists now is a pricing structure, a logistics network, a warranty enforcement protocol, and a fulfillment center 600 miles away that ships parts in 9 days for 3 times what they used to cost. Eugene doesn't talk about it much, but when younger farmers ask him for advice, he shows them the notebook, and he tells them the same thing he told Marcus. You can do it their way if you want, but their way costs more every year, and eventually you'll run out of years before you run out of debt. The notebook is 86 pages now. It gets passed around, it gets updated. It doesn't have a title, but if it did, it would probably say something simple. Something like, what it costs to survive when the system stops working for you. Or maybe just, how 93 farmers remembered how to help each other when no one else would. Eugene doesn't think about it like that. He just thinks about it like farming. You do what works, you adapt, you survive. And when the bills come, you pay them if you can. And if you can't, you find another way. The dealership is still there. Eugene drives past it every week. He doesn't stop anymore. He used to. For 43 years, he used to. But that was before the system decided loyalty was something you could price like a part, and before Eugene decided it wasn't.